5.
There's no reason why the Conservative Party couldn't become extinct.
4.
We've still got a few weeks left of this contest. Let's use it to actually debate policies and ideas.
3.
It's just crazy to have a leadership contest that goes on into November and after the 30th of October, the budget, which is going to be the moment when the country re-engages with politics for one day, having ignored it since the general election.
2.
Miliband and his ilk pose a clear danger to the security and prosperity of the United Kingdom.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Well, the Tory Party Conference is over, and I'm here in Birmingham co-pilot, having spent the last few days sniffing the air in England's second city. Sorry, Manchester. As is Manchester's opposition tries to work out who should be the new Conservative leader. Much of the country, of course, couldn't give a proverbial monkeys about the Tories, Allison. But the result of this protracted leadership contest, yes, the party won't have a new leader in place until early November, a full 4 months on from the general election and after Rachel Reeves' upcoming budget. But the result of this contest really does matter and will do much to set, at the very least, the tone, but also some of the substance of British politics and policy over the next few years. You've meanwhile been beavering away writing about your recent trip to Israel, Allison, a trip that could hardly have been more timely. We've seen in recent days yet another tragic escalation, not just of conflict between Israel and the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas, but also Iran-backed Hezbollah, and over recent days, Iran itself. Because again, having fired dozens and dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles towards Israel in April, Iran has this week launched an even bigger attack. Most missiles, as last time, were shot down by Israeli aerial defense systems, but some did strike Israeli territory. We're going to talk about that, Allison, and also net zero, because you've written a passionate piece about lithium batteries, Velma Strikes Back, energy bills, and Ed Miliband, who I think it's fair to say is not quite your favourite politician. But before we all get to that, from where you're sitting, how does it look in Birmingham?
That's what I'm going to ask you. You're the one who's been there. I've just been getting glimpses of it on the televisual box. Go on. So I did watch the party pieces, as it were, the set speech. Just my little quick take. I thought Tugendhat did worst. I thought James Cleverly was massively pleased with himself, with very little cause, I have to say. But his brand of tickle the tummy soft soap seemed to be going down very well with those assembled. So I have a terrible feeling they're going to put him through. And I don't think that he deserves that at all. His attitude, Liam, which I thought was just extraordinary, was we should never apologise for our record. Never apologise having suffered the most catastrophic defeat in their history. And because of what the Tories did in government, I thought, my two favourites are Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, who I thought both gave very strong, trenchant speeches. But how did it look from in the hall itself?
Well, in the way of these things, Allison, as many journalists know, when you're actually at something, it's quite hard to follow it because you're so in the weeds of it. You were able to watch the television speeches, no doubt with your notebook poised as ever, taking copious notes. I was actually running around with a mobile phone trying to find somewhere to watch the thing because, of course, they wouldn't let me in the conference hall because I'm just a humble journalist. But look, the talk of this conference, and we'll come to this because we're going to speak to one of the leadership candidates later, the talk of this conference has been that clearly the two standout candidates are Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. The talk of the conference has also been, is Jenrick running a Stop Kemi campaign? i.e., will the MPs put through, in their part of the contest, before it gets to party activists, will they put through with their voting Robert Jenrick and then a much weaker candidate by trading votes with each other in order to stop Kemi getting through to the activists' vote? And look, let's be in no doubt, Robert Jenrick has run and is running an extremely impressive campaign. He does have quite a lot of support here among conference goers, Tory party members who will have their vote once the MPs select two candidates. But I would say, certainly in terms of people coming up to me and as a Planet Normal co-host, Telegraph columnist, someone they've seen on the telly and giving me their views or me seeking out their views, I feel there is more on-the-ground support among the activists for Kemi. And I think that's a pretty objective point of view. And polling by the likes of Michael Ashcroft and others confirms that view. It may be, I'm coming away with this conclusion, it may be, just as happened to Michael Portillo back in the day, that the MPs don't put through the candidate who the activists want most. I'm not saying it will happen, but it is the talk of the conference that it might.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult challenge for them, isn't it? Particularly the sort of Jenrick, Badenoch approach, which is to try and level with these people. And I'm not making this up, Liam. I could really detect that James Cleverly's all we need is a bit of unity and a nice smiling conservatism and all will be forgiven. I mean, just, absolutely nonsensical. Don't let anyone trash our record. I'm proud of our record. Just in complete denial of what's happened to the Conservative Party. I mean, they were lucky to get as many MPs as they did, really. So I don't know. I think that they have to appeal to these two constituencies because the MPs, as we've often said on Planet Normal, a lot of the MPs who are left, the sort of Caroline Noakes brigade, who, would be a bit far left in the Liberal Democrats. So they've got to pitch their woo, haven't they, to a very, very wide constituency, which makes it very hard when people are advancing centre-right policies, which is what Jenrick and Kemi are doing. And I think they're treading a very difficult line. My fear, as someone who's got a sort of dog in the game, as it were, is that they'll put Cleverly through. I mean, the Conservative MPs, a lot of them are quite dim. I mean, we know that the present, Labour front bench is absolutely risible, but some of the Tory MPs, I think our colleague Philip Johnson, actually, Liam, eminent screes of the Telegraph commentariat, Philip wrote a terrific column this week, basically saying he didn't think they'd got out of the denial stage of grief, and that if they didn't really wake up and realise the scale of what had happened to them, then, there's no reason why the Conservative Party couldn't become extinct.
I'm just going to say a couple of things about James Cleverly because he is clearly not one of the two strongest candidates.
No.
He just
to
is.
us he isn't, but he was getting a fantastic reception in the room. They liked having him stroke them. They much preferred having him say soothing things about we were wonderful but misunderstood, which to my mind is completely the wrong analysis of a crushing defeat.
Which is what I was going to say. There is a lot of support for him among people in the party because he is, you have to hand it to him, he is a very good communicator. You may not like what he's saying, you may think it's a bit too smoothie pants and consensual, and I'd have to agree with you on that, but he is quite a sure-footed communicator, and I do think whatever happens to him, I'd be amazed if he became leader of the opposition. It could happen, as I'll explain in a minute. But whatever happens, I do think he's enhanced his standing in the party and will be an important player going forward, as indeed will Tom Tugendhat. What's another thing I can report from the ground is even people who are very much, from the part of the party that you're speaking about, Allison, and whose views you are representing here, there's a lot of respect for Tom Tugendhat. There's a lot of respect for Tom Tugendhat, even though, a lot of us would say he's probably a Lib Dem, in suede loafers, to not put too fine a point in it. And again, you and I have been critical, and I've seen some pretty heated, late night debates about this with people supporting our position, really quite very senior people in the party who can't go on the record about this, but are supporting our position about the leadership contest going on for so long. And I think despite that, it has been good for the party, and I would say, without sounding too pompous, for our democracy, that you've had these four leadership candidates slugging it out because they are getting a bit more national news coverage because they're taking lumps out of each other on the stage here in Birmingham. They're standing they will become better known by the public. And I do think it will make the opposition stronger, that there will be, because so many of the old faces have gone, which may well be a good thing, but there will be some people on the front bench who now have a little bit more public profile than they previously had. So for me, that's a good thing about this Tory leadership election, that they've had this kind of four-way beauty contest, as we like to call it. I do think that's done them quite good, but I maintain that it's just crazy to have a leadership contest that goes on into November and after this 30th of October, the budget, which is going to be the moment when the country re-engages with politics for one day, having ignored it since the general election.
I must say, I thought that Kemi's speech was fantastic. Like Jenrick and Tugendhat, she spoke without notes. She was extremely direct. She talked about the truth. You know, people who are not big fans talk about her being abrasive, but I don't think anyone could think that she lacks guts. And she said, we need to stop being afraid of defending our beliefs. And that really will resonate with a lot of people. And as we've said on Planet Normal, Liam, the thing is, when they talk about the sort of unity that James Cleverly preaches and the centre, winning from the centre, the Conservative Party has moved so far to the left, because in his speech, Robert Jenrick talked about the Batley Grammar School teachers had to go into hiding after showing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad in a school lesson, about the mutilation of children, you know, being told that they're trans. And he said, how did we get to this point? And the reason they got to that point is because they ceased to believe in conservative values. So I think if they ended up picking James Cleverly, for me, that would be the end of them. I would absolutely not vote for them under any circumstances, because I want them to be a very, very vivid party of the centre-right, with a critique of the high immigration, the identity politics, the crazy net zero targets. We can argue the toss about environmentalism, but we're going to talk about this. We've seen this week huge changes in our energy provision combined with rising prices and so on. And what Kemi said in her speech was she has fought like crazy for women over these women's spaces and so on, while Labour shouted at her and called her a bigot. And she also talked about this stealthy poisoning of our society needs to stop. So I think for me, if the MPs don't put through Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, then I personally will be very disappointed and will think it's a bit of a travesty.
And just to say, before we move on, because we're going to come back to the Tory party leadership later in the podcast, that is the way James Cleverly could become the leader, because if Jenrick is perceived to have got his supporters to gerrymander the MP's votes to stop Kemi getting through, then she does have a very strong range of support across the activist base. They may take umbrage and they may say, well, we're not giving it to Jenrick, we're going to put Cleverly in instead. Now, look, it all sounds mad, but this stuff has happened before in my lifetime as a professional journalist, so it could happen again. But let's talk about this amazing column that you've written in Wednesday's paper. It's a subject that you and I have discussed a lot over the last year or so, and it's a subject that featured in pretty much all of the leadership candidates' speeches on net zero. As my mum would say, Allison, you almost went into one when it came to this column, because, and I've seen this a lot over recent years, when you really get into a subject, you realise so much stuff that the mainstream media has yet to unearth. And you've been having lots of conversations, haven't you, with people about battery power and energy policy, and it's kind of come together in this week's Telegraph. And of course, there's a link to that article in the show notes to this episode. What made you focus on that subject this week?
Yeah, the column's a bit like a lithium ion battery, Liam. Once it sets on fire, there's no way of putting it out. Why did I settle on it? It's a couple of reasons. I've been in conversation with Professor Peter Edwards. He's the Emeritus Professor of Inorganic Chemistry at Oxford. And Pete, who is a Planet Normal devotee, has been telling me for quite some time that these lithium ion batteries are potentially very, very dangerous. So I did a sort of a hypothetical story at the top of the column, which is a fire at a giant solar farm in East Anglia was raging out of control and causing lots of toxic gases to be released into the air, along with particulates and so on. Now, that may seem like one of those Orson Welles War of the Worlds things, where he says aliens are invading, but it's just true, Liam. This is, Professor Edwards says, it's not if this happens, it's when. All right. So we are going to have, in the next decade or so, we will have some terrible lithium battery fire, unfortunately. And it was matched with two other sort of very pivotal moments in our industrial history. So the Port Talbot Steelworks, where Liam, that one of my relatives works, and my mum's best friend's son has got an excellent job there. Well, the Port Talbot Tata Steelworks has just shut down with loss of 2,800 jobs. And the result of that is that Britain is no longer able to make high caliber steel, which is the basic material for our own defence. And surely by coincidence in India, Tata Steel is of course an India company, Tata just opened a blast furnace of the type they closed in Wales in India. So I'm sure they won't be taking any of Port Talbot's order books, will they, Liam? They wouldn't do anything like that. So the Port Talbot, just to look at this, the Port Talbot's plant, the fate was sealed really by the soaring cost of UK electricity, now the most expensive in the developed world. And the price of power, this is a bit like you, isn't it? I'm sounding a bit like you. The price of power for industrial businesses has jumped 124%.
I'm sprouting blonde hair and wearing kitten heels. We're turning into each other.
We're getting so slim. We're easily confused. The other landmark moment, as Ed Miliband said in a jubilant video, a landmark moment for clean energy and the last coal-fired power station in Britain, that's Ratcliffe-on-Soar in Nottinghamshire, closed. Now, we did hear from various readers and listeners saying they often drive past that power station, and it has been very actively in use, Liam. A safety net in case all these renewables that Ed Miliband is convinced are marvellous are not working. And do you want a Velma stat?
Sorry, I haven't had much sleep for the last couple of days.
I know, that's a very hungover Scooby, if I might say so. So in Germany, where the government has just announced that it will not pull forward the country's coal power phase out to 2030, from the officially agreed exit date of 2038. So Germany is hanging on to its coal-fired power stations to protect its energy security and make sure Germany stays competitive. But we have the mad Miliband creature who is embarked on an ideological quest. I think facts are far less important in net zero, Liam, than ideology. And I just finished this bit with something that Kemi Badenoch called net zero unilateral economic disarmament. Miliband and his ilk pose a clear danger to the security and prosperity of the United Kingdom.
I must say, I think in recent months, and I think Planet Normal's been at the forefront of this, if I may say so, there has been a focus on the reality, like the industrial reality, the economic reality of these net zero policies. The idea that if renewables are so cheap, why have we got the most expensive electricity in Europe, even though we've got one of the highest renewable shares in our electricity generation? It just doesn't add up, Ed. It just doesn't add up. And I'd say that what the trade unions are saying, it's absolutely incredible that Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, the second biggest union, and Gary Smith, the General Secretary of the GMB, the third biggest union, were openly criticising a Labour leader over these policies at the Labour Party's first conference in power for well over a decade. But we will come back to that subject because just finally, before we move on to our Planet Normal guest, I did want to mention briefly Israel because we talk a lot off the podcast as well as on the podcast. And I know you are still really coming to terms with what you saw on your recent trip. And indeed, while you've been writing up a lot of your on-the-ground reporting, we've had an escalation in the last couple of days of violence, tragedy across the Middle East.
Yeah, we certainly have. Now I'm writing two big pieces to mark the first anniversary of the 7th of October massacres, and they will be available in the Daily Telegraph and the website from this weekend. And of course, that's been fairly harrowing. But we should say, Liam, that with this absolute turbulence in the Middle East, this is when our energy security, as a nation, we are now almost uniquely vulnerable to turbulent international conditions. So I want us to have a bet about when the first power cut is going to be. But just to say that I have been speaking to contacts in Israel, including former Mossad people. This is a strange thing to say, perhaps, but the IDF and Israel, the government, was absolutely humiliated on the 7th of October last year when 1,200 of its people, including many, many young people, were butchered in the most horrific way. And what's happened in the last few weeks, both with the Israel blowing up or getting members of Hezbollah to blow themselves up with pagers, these extraordinary high-tech attacks, the targeting of all of the senior Hezbollah leadership have basically been wiped out. And it was put to me, Liam, by someone very senior in Israel, that this was a moment of redemption for the IDF. Just before they're coming up to this first anniversary, there's a lot of anger against the government, Netanyahu, and the IDF in Israel. They were described to me as cocky, arrogant, complacent, hubris. They allowed people to be massacred. So this now, a year on, really this extraordinary sticking it to Iran is, I think, being seen perhaps as a moment of redemption for the IDF, saying that, you know, we're not going to be beaten, we're not going to be done down. And there's a lot of talk, I think there's a lot of ignorant talk in the mainstream media about what's going on. But as far as my source, who has been very senior in Mossad on Iran, says that what they are doing now is they are going over the border into Lebanon in a very, very limited way. And the idea is to enforce the 2006, there was a resolution, UN Security Council resolution 1701 at the end of the 2006 Lebanon war. And that resolution, which has never been enforced, called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon to be replaced in that 18-mile strip across the border by Lebanese troops and a United Nations force. And no armed forces from anywhere except this United Nations body would ever be south of the Litani River in Lebanon. Now that, as we know, has been absolutely comprehensively violated by Hezbollah, who have buried missiles and so on, particularly in domestic dwellings. So I think where we are now is we are going to see this quite limited, targeted ground invasion, and Israel is going to enable, possibly by the first anniversary of the 7th of October, enable her 80,000 citizens who've had to evacuate their homes from northern Israel and leave because they have been bombarded with rocket attacks every single day since the 8th of October. So there's your co-pilot's quick international analysis. I trust my sources. I think that's probably a pretty fair reflection of what the aim is.
Now on to our Planet Normal guest. Robert Jenrick's the Tory MP for Newark in Nottinghamshire, which he won in a by-election entering the Commons in 2014. Born in 1982, Jenrick is a father of three who served as Minister of State for Immigration from 2022 to 2023, having previously been Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government from 2019 to 2021. Born in Wolverhampton, Jenrick read history at Cambridge, then qualified as a solicitor. He made his political name when he resigned as Minister for State for Immigration over, quotes, strong disagreements with the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak regarding the government's Rwanda asylum plan to tackle illegal immigration, which Jenrick argued didn't go far enough. Now the bookies' favourite to succeed Sunak as Tory leader, Allison and I caught up with Robert Jenrick amidst the bustle of the Tory conference.
Robert, congratulations on your speech today, all done without auto cue. I imagine it must have been very nerve-wracking. And your mum, Jenny, a Planet Normal listener, no less, was in the audience. You were pretty forthright to the Conservative conference. The country doesn't trust us right now, our worst ever electoral defeat, compared to the approach, the sort of tickle the tummy of the Tories' approach of James Cleverly. You were being a bit, playing a bit more hardball. Do you think that's a calculated risk, or do you think that it's worth it to level with people about where you think the party is?
Well, I thought so. As you say, there's always another style you can do. But I didn't want to approach this whole leadership election in platitudes. I wanted to speak some hard truths to our party. And by that, I mean us, the MPs, not so much the members or our voters, because I think we've failed to deliver on some of the biggest issues facing our country, on immigration, on the economy, on the NHS. And if we're going to change, we've got to listen to the public. We've got to listen to people who vote for us or who we want to vote for us and tell them, persuade them that we have actually changed. And it's only if we do that we can begin the long road back. So I was a little nervous about speaking so honestly about our position and our record. But I was very pleased by the good reaction that I got back, because I think that the membership get it. They understand that we didn't get things right. We got some things right, but we didn't deliver on the most important things, and we've got to change.
Robert, as you know, I've been here in Birmingham sniffing, I was going to say the sea breeze, but conferences aren't seaside resorts anymore, are they?
You're in the Midlands, Halligan.
Welcome to the Midlands.
Yeah, I'm probably as far away from the sea as I could possibly be.
Well, we'll take you to North Wales one day. Another day.
So I've been doing what a lot of journalists do. I've been in the bars and the fringe meetings because I'm a Planet Normal co-pilot, Telegraph columnist. Lots of people come up to me, want to know what I think, and then give me their views, which is, of course, what's really valuable. And I'll get into some of those further down this interview, but I just wanted to ask you a really general question, because a lot of the country will be asking this. Who cares who the next Tory leader is? Why is it important?
I think it's very important for us. I mean, firstly, the country needs a strong leader of the opposition, doesn't it? I mean, that, whatever your politics, that's incredibly important. And I would argue that the first 3 months of this Labour government have been pretty poor. For a government so fresh, it seems so stale. They're making all manner of mistakes, and they're hurting my people, working people and pensioners, taking away the winter fuel allowance, preparing the country for big tax rises. But more importantly than that, in fact, this is the argument that I made in the speech today, I think the country faces big, big challenges. I made a comparison with the 1970s. And of course, the issues are different, but there is a parallel, because the country faces, I think, it's systemic challenges. How do you deal with mass migration? How do you get growth going again in our country and make people feel better off? How do you get things like the NHS and the state actually working when today a lot of it seems so broken? And if we're going to fix those problems, you need a strong Conservative Party, because I don't think the Labour Party are going to have the answers to that. I think you've seen that already. And I want the Tory Party to be the serious party once again. I want us to be grappling with those things, just as we did at our best in the past, in the late 70s and in the 80s. And it's on us, my generation of Conservative politicians, to step up, to formulate those ideas, to lay out the trade-offs, to be honest with the public, and come forward with proper solutions to the challenges that we're facing.
In your speech, you talked about 5 changes or 5 stands, and you were straight in with number 1, must secure our borders. And we know that a lot of Conservative voters, indeed the majority of the country, would be agreeing with you there. You said that under the Conservatives, 120,000 illegal migrants entered the UK. I should say, Robert, it amused me actually yesterday when we learnt that every chicken in the United Kingdom was going to have to be identified legally, when we can't identify most of the illegal migrants who've come into our country. That's another legacy of the Tory government. But you, almost alone of the leadership candidates, are saying absolutely emphatically we must leave the ECHR and free ourselves from Blair's Human Rights Act. Others are saying it's not necessary to do that. Are you right?
Yes, I believe I am. And I've given this a great deal of thought. I've not come to it from an ideological perspective, but from a practical one, on the basis of my experience as a minister. Look, I think there are two ways in which you can approach a leadership election like this. You can talk in platitudes. You can just try and make people feel better about themselves, put a smile on the party's face, or you can use it to lay out some actual policies and use it to get a mandate to change the party, change the country. And one of those changes I think is absolutely critical. In fact, I think it's existential for the party, is that we leave the ECHR so that we can secure our borders. There are those who say, oh, you can reform it. This is an organisation of 46 member states, from Iceland to Andorra to Hungary. No one believes you can reform it. That is just a comfort blanket. It's a fantasy. As if you want to secure your borders, if you want to get terrorists and foreign criminals out of our country, as I do, you have to leave. And so far, in this contest, I'm the only one who's willing to say that. I think there are millions of people in the country who agree with me and want us to change direction. I hope we can use this election to settle this issue, add it to the stable of Conservative Party policies, and then if we're lucky enough to win the next election, get on and do it.
Yes, just quickly, Robert. Germany's recently deported Afghan rapists and murderers to Afghanistan and is in the process of sending prisoners back to Syria. Now, Germany's in the ECHR. Just to check, do you think it's the case that the UK has been more rule-abiding than other EU countries when it came to some of these international treaties?
I do. We have a tendency to gold-plate them. But our legal system is very different to Germany's. And that, I think, has meant that our country has struggled to handle the way that since the 1970s, frankly, the court has started to creep into other areas of our life. We're also, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, a country of laws. You know, we're not a country where our leaders tend to ignore the law. We tend to respect it. And that means I think we have to be intellectually honest and not say, we're going to stay in something even though we fundamentally disagree with it and we want to ignore it on a whole range of different things. I think it's better to be honest, to leave, and then to replace it with a British Bill of Rights. And I'm confident that, you know, Magna Carta and habeas corpus, a country with fantastic legal minds like Lord Jonathan Sumption, who advocates leaving the ECHR, is more than capable of drafting something which will secure our own freedoms and liberties.
Some of your opponents would say, Robert, and I've heard this from quite a lot of the party members who I've spoken to here in Birmingham, they'd say that's all very well, but this is someone who, until quite recently, and up until the Brexit referendum, of course, you were arguing for us to stay in the European Union. Now, there are decent arguments on either side, in my view, and I know you agree, we've discussed it in the past. But how can you now say that securing our borders is the most important thing when, until relatively recently in your adult life, you were saying that we should be part of a zone where we can't limit immigration at all from the European Union?
Well, I think it's a fair question. I think over my time in government, I saw things which, in fact, most people don't see, which made me feel stronger and stronger on this issue. Unlike pretty much any other recent immigration minister, I actually went to talk to the people who live in Dover, who've had illegal migrants in their kitchens and in their gardens. There was a riot in Knowsley at one of the hotels. I actually went to Knowsley and talked to people in that community to understand what was going on. You know, I came to see that this was an issue of such importance and it was doing so much harm to our country. And when I travelled around Europe and North Africa, I came to the view that this wasn't going to go away. This isn't some passing fad. This is a question of our generation. The next 20, 30 years of European, in fact, Western politics is going to be dominated by this issue. And if a party of the centre-right, like the Conservative Party, does not stand for fixing this issue, then we're going to subject our country to decades of this issue. And there will be other parties that will rise up, reform, but also parties of the far right, you know, darker forces.
Properly nasty parties, like we're seeing on the continent.
And I just don't want that. I want the Conservative Party to fix this problem.
Robert, this week we've seen the last coal-fired power station in the country, Ratcliffe-on-Soar. It's in your part of the world. Nottinghamshire, Ed Miliband issuing a triumphant video celebrating the closing down of this extraordinary structure. Listeners and readers who live in Nottinghamshire tell me that the station was very regularly in use as a kind of safety net when the wind didn't blow and the sun didn't shine. Now, in your speech, you did actually, I was pleased to see that you actually addressed net zero. Not many politicians are prepared to do that because it seems to be a sort of universally accepted, we're all signed up to this. You did talk about mad policies arising from crazy interim targets. Now, it was a Conservative government that wrote the net zero target into law with almost no discussion. How do you reflect on that? And what would you say to the 2,800 men and women in Port Albert, my part of the world, who this week are out of work now because the steelworks, our last steelworks capable of making military grade steel, has been shut?
Well, I know that power station very well. In fact, when I drive from London home to my constituency, it's the kind of thing you see that makes you know you've come home. It's the iconic structure. And it makes me feel sad that it's closing. It's the end of an era for Nottinghamshire, which of course had such a proud mining and energy history. But what I said in my speech today was I want us to have a very different energy policy as a country. I want us to go for cheap and reliable energy because our recent energy policy, and certainly the one that Ed Miliband is now about to embark on, is going to see bills soaring for households and it's going to further deindustrialise our country. As you say, Allison, we've lost our steel industry. It's going to make many other heavy industries increasingly uncompetitive in our country. I'm not a climate change skeptic. I want us to cut our emissions, but I don't want us to do it on the backs of working people or by further deindustrializing this country. I think that we should acknowledge that gas is here to stay for the medium term. And so we should keep open. In fact, I'm open to building more gas-fired power stations as they are in many other countries around the world. We should be investing in new nuclear. We've been far too slow as a country at doing that. And we should be cutting some of the subsidies for offshore wind and other renewables. That is a much more logical energy policy for our country that puts the interests of our own people first. And that's what I advocate. I'm going to be fighting Ed Miliband tooth and nail because he's doing completely the opposite. He's going to carpet the countryside in Chinese solar panels. He's going to be closing down coal-fired and gas power stations. And that's a big mistake.
Do you think, Robert, that the country's gone slightly mad, the political and media class has gone slightly mad when it comes to climate policy? You're not a climate skeptic, nor am I. We all want less pollution. But one of your rivals in this leadership campaign, she often talks about being an engineer and coming to a problem with a plan and all the rest of it. Is it true that your government just announced a policy, albeit before you were in the Commons, in order to be the first in the world to announce it without any real backing behind it?
Yes. I mean, I think it was a fundamentally unserious policy. I remember talking to Philip Hammond, who was Chancellor, and to his credit, argued against this. He tried to get the Treasury to do an impact assessment, which came to an astronomical figure on what this would cost. You know, it's the biggest change to our economy and our society since the Industrial Revolution. And yet it was waved through in the House of Commons, I think with 90 minutes of debate, if you can call it that. I met a Treasury official.
And Ken Clarke voted against, didn't he? One or two Tories voted against.
One or two did. I think on the principle that it was just so poorly thought through. I met a Treasury official who said to me that there was more thought on banning plastic straws than on net zero 2050. And I mean, it speaks to a broader truth, doesn't it? That I don't think our politics is very serious anymore. What I tried to do in the speech today is say, we've got these massive generational challenges. Let's have a serious debate about them. Let's set out trade-offs. I think the public are yearning for that. My instinct is that the public are sick of simplistic solutions, sticking plasters. They want us to actually be grappling with, why is this country not doing as well as it should do? We have so many strengths as a country. This is a great country. But why is our economy flatlying? Why does the NHS not really work? Why can young people not get on the housing ladder? Let's actually focus on these things. And I know we're in opposition now. So some people say, let's wait 4 or 5 years. I want to bring that forward. I have given these things thought. I've got very clear ideas. I've not got a monopoly on wisdom, but I have got a clear plan as to where I want to take the party and the country. So let's use this leadership election to settle some of these big challenges, use it as a kind of a cauldron of debate, and then let's move forward with confidence.
You had a very powerful section of the speech where you said about the Batley teacher and his family still in hiding, having given a free speech lesson to his secondary school pupils and shown them a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. You also spoke about thousands of children having life-altering surgery on the NHS because of being told that they're trans. And you said, Robert, how have we come to this point? Now, these things were happening under a Conservative government. They strike me as being profoundly unconservative. What do you attribute this institutional timidity to? Why were your colleagues sitting there going along with things and being too scared to challenge these people who shout Islamophobia at the drop of a hat and these people who say you're transphobic? Where was the courage?
Well, I think courage has been lacking. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I've spoken out against things like Islamist extremism, and one of the very few people who have. And obviously, you get abuse, and I've had death threats. Even in the House of Commons, people shout at you.
Gosh, have you? What do they shout at you?
They kind of call me racist, and they gasp as if it's outrageous to say that shouting jihad off Oxford Street, is a bad thing. So I think there's an element to which that we have lacked courage, and that we have too easily gone along with a kind of Westminster establishment view rather than speaking up for the silent majority in our country. I found that when I have, people have been very relieved that somebody has the guts to take a stand on these issues. But I think there's also a broader issue that we failed to take on the kind of status quo that we inherited from the last Labour government, whether that's in the civil service, whether it's in the quangos that are run by left-wing and liberal-minded people, or whether it's in this network of laws, like the Climate Change Act, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, yes, the ECHR. And what I've advocated, and I said in this speech, is that one of the great conservative reforms that we should do, if we're lucky enough to get back into office, is a great reform act that gets rid of all that legacy and enables ministers to be ministers, to be accountable, to get decisions done. So if you do have brave people who care passionately on education, welfare, on immigration, on net zero, on the most contested issues in British life today, they can actually do things and deliver next time.
Robert, it amazes me. Please don't take this the wrong way. And Planet Normal listeners will know why I'm saying this. You were born in 1982. That's just an astonishing... Right, co-pilot. And here you are. You're obviously a very senior politician now, and you're bidding to be the leader of your party, and indeed the leader one day, if your plans go well for you, of our country. But Allison and I remember the 70s. We were there. We also remember previous Tory leadership campaigns and the time when there was a very popular frontline politician called Michael Portillo. And he was the darling of the Conservative activists. He was a bit too right for a lot of the MPs' tastes. His name ended in a vowel. He was a little bit strange. He had a bit of a weird background. And yet he was an extremely polished performer and a very serious intellect, as he is to this day. And I know you know him well, as we all do. I bring up Michael Portillo because, of course, there was a Stop Michael campaign. He didn't get through to the party activists because MPs stopped him from getting through. And party activists, they still talk about it to this day. Half a dozen party activists have come up to me and said, is there a Stop Kemi campaign? Is Jenrick going to trade votes to stop Kemi getting through?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, that's laughable. I mean, that is in the conspiracy theory box. I've been working so hard over this summer, talking to people. I've done more events than anyone else. I've been in all four corners of the United Kingdom. There is no world in which anyone would do that. You know, we're just trying to get.
Well, they did it in the early 2000s to somebody called Michael Portillo.
Well,
you were doing your GCSEs, I think, if my maths is correct.
I do dimly remember that period. I was a member of the Conservative Party back then. But no, absolutely not. Everyone is just trying to ride their own horse. I do not.
I've got to put that question.
I don't believe anyone. I don't believe anyone
doing
that.
The conference.
And look at the issues that I'm taking on. I mean, my campaign is raising, I think, the hardest truths on this campaign. No one else is saying things like leave the ECHR or change radically our net zero policy or help young people onto the housing ladder by getting more homes built. I would argue that head and shoulders over any of the other campaigns. We're taking on the tough issues. We're sometimes saying hard truths to the membership. And on other issues, like immigration, we are the voice of the membership, making sure that the next Conservative leader and the party to come actually does what the membership wants, which is to be more conservative. I wrote in the Telegraph earlier in the summer what I think the 10 principles of conservatism are. The only candidate who's set out an actual intellectual vision for the future of our party, because I want the party to get back to its enduring values and principles. And I want every MP and councillor to sign up to something like that, because so many people have said to me, including the members over the summer, I don't know what the party stands for anymore. I'm on the doorstep and people are saying it's interchangeable, the Lib Dems or the Labour Party. That's the reason we lost so many votes for this election. And, going back to one of the points earlier about why didn't we deliver? Well, one of the reasons we didn't deliver was we lost the ballast that comes with knowing exactly what you stand for. I would argue that as much, perhaps more so than any of the other candidates, I've got a very clear sense, conviction about what the party needs to stand for, what it needs to do, where it needs to go next.
In a powerful video, you claim that British Special Forces are, quotes, killing rather than capturing terrorists. You said that human rights law would make it difficult for British forces to conduct a similar operation to the one that the United States did to kill or capture Osama bin Laden. So basically, you're saying that the human rights apparatus standing in the way of our operational effectiveness. Now, Tom Tugendhat, your leadership rival, said that he was very angry at your comments, says that the assertion was a very serious accusation and showed a fundamental lack of awareness of military operations and the nature of the law in the armed forces. Do you stand by what you said?
Yes, absolutely. But this is a point that was made by our highly respected former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who in his first intervention after leaving office in the Telegraph said that he didn't think the UK would be able to do the same kind of intervention that the US did to go in and kill or capture Osama bin Laden. And the point that he was making and that I made was that the decision makers in the military and in government are sometimes pushed to take lethal action like drone strikes rather than sending in people on the ground to capture individuals from whom you might get important intelligence because of our human rights architecture. And I think that's wrong. I want to give the armed forces, our generals, our ministers, the most flexibility to do what is right for the security of our people and for the security of our armed forces personnel. Not be worried about how this plays with the ECHR. What is the legal advice from our human rights lawyers is one of the reasons, and there are several, why we should be leaving the ECHR.
Robert, Allison and I have been critical of the length of this leadership contest. By the time the party decides, it will be 4 months from a general election. And of course, it will be after a budget that could be really pivotal. Certainly, that will be a moment when the whole country re-engages with politics for one day, having ignored politics in the main since the general election. Having said that, I think Allison and I both agree it's been good for your party and indeed for our democracy that the four of you have been here slugging it out because you've been getting media coverage. I think all of you have enhanced your profile, your authority in the country such as it is. In that spirit, would you offer your three other leadership candidates a front bench position were you to win?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I have huge respect and friendship with each of them. That's really important to me. I do, however, want this thing to be over sooner. I want to be, if I'm lucky enough to lead this party, the one standing at the dispatch box taking on Rachel
I personally
Reeves.
think it's mad.
I think it is a mad decision by, whoever it is and the powers that be in CCHQ that we're doing this, because that's going to be a very important moment for our party and for the country. It should be the new leader of the opposition who's doing that. Second thing I'd just say is that we've still got a few weeks left of this contest. Let's use it to actually debate policies and ideas. Let's not just use it to talk about, platitudes, who's the friendliest person, who's the most affable person. It has to be an actual debate. That is what I've been trying to do throughout the summer. Let's use it to settle some of these issues like should we be in the ECHR or not? I think that is helpful to the party. If we don't do that, then it's just a recipe for more infighting, loss of public trust, more drift. I want to end this contest, if I win, with a mandate to take the party in a particular direction. And that is a direction which is more conservative, I would argue, and is going to change the country positively.
I saw a lovely photograph of you at home when you were a little boy in Wolverhampton.
Wolverhampton.
Apologies to everybody from Wolverhampton listening to this podcast.
I am from Wolverhampton. I'm allowed to say
At my co-pilot's ridiculous attempt at Wolverhampton.
It was pretty good, actually.
Crawler.
My best childhood friend was from Wolverhampton, and I started speaking Welsh with a Wolverhampton accent, mate.
I'm back in my box.
No one has ever spoken Welsh with a Wolverhampton accent before. It was an absolute triumph. But Robert, I saw this little boy with a pudding basin haircut, and you came from quite a humble home. It was very recognisable as the kind of home that Liam and I, although a bit older than you, would have recognised. And I was wondering, looking at that little boy, you're now trying to lead this rather grand party, mixing with the great and the good and the very wealthy. What would that little boy think of Robert Jenrick now? And what would you, if you were the Tory party leader, want to do for all those little Robert Jenricks and Sophie Jenricks, all the little ones that came from your home? What would you do to make them a better country?
Oh, what a lovely question. Well, I think I had the little Robert Jenrick had dreams. I don't know if it was to be leader of the Conservative Party. But yeah, a lot has happened in the intervening years. And it was a source of pride to me to have my mum and dad here today. We've come a long way. They both grew up in pretty modest working class backgrounds in Liverpool and Manchester. My mum is a big fan of this podcast.
Yes. Hello, Jenny. Hello.
She wanted to meet you today. But on a serious note, as I've said throughout this leadership contest, whatever you choose to call it, Boris called it levelling up, Disraeli more grandly called it One Nation. The Conservative Party has to be a national party. It's got to think of itself as a trade union for the working people of this country. And you've got to see yourself through the eyes of a young boy growing up in Wolverhampton in a working class or middle class background, a normal background that millions of people in our country do, and trying to give those people every opportunity to succeed in life. They don't have to grow up in London. I went to London maybe half a dozen times before I was 18. Never been on a plane before I was 18. This isn't unusual. This is just the lives of most people in our country. I'm not, suggesting it's something out of the ordinary. I want the Conservative Party to be very clear about who its people are. It was like that. I remember in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher spoke of our people. I've got a very clear sense of who our people are, and we've got to do everything we can to support them and make them succeed.
Robert Jenrick, you've been campaigning at a frenetic pace, as we say to all the leadership candidates we talk to. Good luck, and thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Thanks very much for having me again.
Thanks so much.
So there you go, Allison. Another Planet Normal exclusive. Robert Jenrick. I have to say, he is running a very professional campaign. The thing for me, will it be a little bit too professional, a little bit too slick, a little bit too, shall I say, ruthless for the party activists?
This is what they're up against. I was going to say I don't like politics. That sounds a bit strange given what we talk about the whole time. But this is the part of it I really can't stand. I really dislike it. That's one reason I don't think I would flourish with it, really. Yeah, it's quite a brutal business, isn't it? I think he's very hungry for it. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think he's very, very hungry for the top job. And I think he's sort of set his sights on it. And I think a lot of what he's been saying is extremely powerful. And when I hear him speak and I hear Kemi speak, I feel grateful that there are people like that on my side of the net who are able to speak so well and articulate concerns, which resonate with me. I think what I pick up from listeners and from readers occasionally is Do you believe Jenrick's Damascene conversion? I mean, that's the lingering doubt. Is this was a politician who voted Remain, who was a great sort of Rishi mucker, and he was known as Jenrick, wasn't he, as a sort of middle of the road politician. So we have to slightly take it on trust that he's, being immigration minister woke him up. He's certainly been speaking a lot of sense about the impact of mass immigration on cultural cohesion. We should also say, Liam, that we're both big fans of Kemi as well. But, she has been, she's been courting controversy. That's slightly her style, isn't it? But she said some very, very bold things about civil servants, 10% of civil servants basically being so awful they belonged in jail. You had lots of po-faced BBC people analysing that comment when it was clearly meant as a funny aside. She also said something controversial about maternity pay having gone too far. Now, I looked at that interview. I don't think that's exactly what she said. I think she's talking about the burden on businesses. And in her characteristic style, she was being upfront about where some of these entitlements, what they do to small businesses. What do you think? You were actually sitting next to him. You like him?
Yeah, he's a very impressive guy. I mean, it is amazing. I don't mean this in a patronising way at all, but we're now sort of we've been knocking around for a while, Allison, and here's a guy who was born in 1982 who's got a very good chance of leading the Conservative Party and ultimately, obviously, it's a slippery pole, becoming Prime Minister of this country. Rishi Sunak was born in 1980. We actually lived the 70s, didn't we? We ate so many spangles our teeth rotted.
I was at university when Robert was born, so that just, although I spent my adolescence very near where his constituency is now. And I think it's a point he made in his speech, which was very strong, was that while, Tory seats were falling like skittles, Robert held on to his seat in Nottinghamshire, while no other Tory held a seat in Nottinghamshire or indeed in Derbyshire. But he held his. And why did he hold his? Because he had taken a principled stand. And I think his voters in the constituency, they appreciated the fact that this was, a Tory who had walked the walk. So I think there's everything to play for. And I actually think this could be an extraordinary time, because I do think enormous amounts of gossip and sleaze swirling around the Labour Party, only newly arrived Labour Party. I mean, never mind a honeymoon. There's practically like the 7-year itch before they've even got out of the traps, isn't it? With all this Lord Waid Ali. Do any of them buy their own clothes? What is this? I mean, it's, 100 grand here. I mean, by the way, did you hear Starmer giving that absolutely po-faced interview in which he claimed that his son, who was doing his GCSEs, couldn't revise in Kentish Town with a couple of old hacks outside the front door, so had to be taken to a Covent Garden penthouse to do his revision. And I posted on Twitter about this, Liam, and got the most hilarious responses. People from yours and my type of background who'd done their revision in bus stops and in sort of freezing kitchens. And I did my revision on my little single bed with the candlewick bedspread and no desk, of course, in our house.
I'm a proper bloke, so of course I didn't do any revision. I just pulled an all-nighter. But just to go back briefly, I was in the room when Kemi made that comment about the civil service, and it was completely a joke. It was a home crowd.
It was a joke.
It was a spectator fringe meeting.
Yes.
It was actually Fraser Nelson, who I would like to pay tribute to on this podcast as a superb editor of The Spectator. It was quite emotional because it was his last ever act as Spectator editor, was to interview Kemi Badenoch at an excellent Spectator fringe event. And the room was by no means full of, dyed-in-the-wall Kemi supporters, but there certainly was a lot of love for her in the room, and indeed for Fraser. And it was a kind of light-hearted, flippant comment, but I knew sitting there, instantly, the journalist in me said, that's the headline. She's going to get, because the reality is, and this is the sad thing about the state of our politics, the public wants politicians to show some personality and some humanity and kicking back and not just be robots, right? And crack a joke here and there and just show that they're normal people, right? Planet normal people, if you like. But, a lot of the media just won't have that if you say it, right? And it's a gaffe and it's a front page story and it's really, really damaging. During a period like this, when there is so much scrutiny on the candidates and, a lot of the left is happy to see the stronger candidates, misstep and say things that can then be reported accurately but completely out of context, you just got to be ultra disciplined and careful. And that is a sort of unnatural thing for somebody to do who is like Kemi or indeed like Robert Jenrick. Both these people have actually quite a lot of personality. And I think we heard that in Jenrick's interview there. And we've seen that on the campaign trail, if you like, during this contest with Kemi. But you can't joke around in politics. It's sad and a shame that you can't, but it's just the reality, particularly in the middle of a leadership campaign.
It's only our trade, though, isn't it? What a miserable bunch journalists are. Because I remember all the way back, Liam, to the 1997 election campaign when I was interviewing Blair and John Major, spending quite a lot of time with them. And I remember being on this plane sitting next to John Major, who is a very funny mimic and just actually very quick-witted. You would have realised none of that from his sort of grey persona. And I said to him, Prime Minister, if people knew what you were like, that you were actually this incredibly funny, and he was quite flirty as well. Well, I suppose maybe they could have told that because of the Edwina Curry stuff. But anyway, and then he said, Allison, if I say anything like that, it will be a gaffe. And I thought, how sad, isn't it, that what would make him more relatable, that people would like, was just a gaffe, so you can't say anything original. And if you are quick-witted, as Kemi is, as Robert is, that you have to be so disciplined and basically tamp down any quick-wittedness in yourself. I mean, I would hate to live like that. And it's a great shame because we do get the colourless politicians, and then everyone complains that they're drones, don't they?
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Liam, we had a lot of enthusiasm for your interview of the Reform Party chairman, Zia Youssef. And this is Annalise. I have just finished listening to the podcast and found myself very impressed with pretty much all that Zia Youssef said. I voted Reform this time, having been a lifelong Conservative, but feel I am one of those people who could swing either way at the next general election. I was going to write as soon as the interview finished, but I waited to hear what you both had to say. And sure enough, as always, Allison, you took the words right out of my mouth. I found Zia's dismissal of the prospective Tory leaders short-sighted, but also a bit irritating. This constant criticism of the other side is so negative. I would much rather hear something along the lines of, like us, the Tories have their work cut out, but we should never rest on our laurels. There are a couple of potentially strong candidates, and we have to make sure we promote a better option in all areas, etc. I really don't want to hear the same old, they're rubbish, they're failures. I want honesty, but I also want positivity. Promote yourself without dismissing the others, unless it's the revolting Starmer et al. Then you can be as critical as you like, says Annalise. Gosh, I've rarely had such a strong reaction to a person, but I cannot even look at Starmer, let alone listen to him. I'm convinced he's a bad un and await his downfall with eager anticipation. Thank you both so much, Allison and Liam, for all the work you do. I know so many listeners say it, but you really do reassure me every week that I'm not going mad. Best wishes, Annalise.
And just on Reform, Allison, I should say that I've witnessed and been very close to conversations between senior, very experienced Conservative Party MPs and members and people at this conference who I know are very, very close to Reform. So they won't say it and Reform won't say it. But in the end, there is going to have to be, I think, some kind of coming together of the two now distinct and disparate parties of the British centre-right and right. And I think that will happen over the next few years as public discontent with the Labour government grows. Just putting that out there. This is from Robert. The more I read about the energy policy of the current government, the more convinced I am that it will lead to an economically disastrous dead end. Your interview with Tom Tugendhat touched on some of it, but from what he said, I don't believe he understands the real problem. Most of that discussion was about net zero and green energy. That is simply replacing existing power sources, not about expanding electricity generating capacity. Artificial intelligence is growing fast and will lead the world into a new industrial age. AI, says Robert, requires huge amounts of power, and that power needs to be always available because it depends on very large data warehouses that consume a lot of electricity that must be ultra reliable. Wind and solar are intermittent and unreliable energy sources, so you have to build a parallel system to supply electricity. In the US, utility companies are postponing the shutting of coal-fired plants and older nuclear plants because they're seeing a huge growth in demand from a rapid expansion of data centers, and building new generation capacity will take years. Elon Musk is now speaking publicly about this and has warned that there will soon be insufficient electricity to, quote, run the chips. That statement is thought to be a bit hyperbolic, but perhaps not. The owners of these new data centres will be turning to natural gas turbines to power them, as it's the only reliable energy source that can be accessed quickly. Meanwhile, the UK is shutting down North Sea oil and gas, has banned the exploitation of onshore natural gas, and is not building new electricity generation capacity at sufficient pace to satisfy what I believe, says Robert, will be an exploding demand. The Telegraph has carried several stories about the inability of electric utilities to supply power to planned data centres west of London. The data centres will either not be built or will be delayed for years. This will only get worse, and the consequence to the UK's economic future will be huge. The lack of reliable and cheap electricity will result in the shrinking and even disappearance of entire industries, and the UK will not be able to support its current level of prosperity. Mr. Miliband's answer is to strum his guitar while the UK's economic future goes up in smoke.
And two short ones to finish. This is from Andrew to me on Twitter. This is one of my favourite remarks of the week. Andrew says, I just hope Israel can save Western civilization before Western civilization can stop them. Very true, Andrew. And this is from Mike. I just love you two. Enough said.
Someone's
Very
got to.
Best wishes, Mike.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. As we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views, email of the week, it's my turn. And it has to be Robert. It has to be Robert. That is a really interesting email, Robert. The link between AI, the massive demand for electricity, which AI intrinsically requires, and the fact that you now have data centres that need to be built in the UK not being built because the sites can't get connected to the national grid, which can often take years and years.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen to this podcast, because it don't half cheer me and the co-pilot up in this gloomy weather when we're not eating any food because we're in a competition to lose weight.
She had to mention it, didn't she? So, Robert, do send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.uk, put mug winner in the subject heading and give us your postal address and you'll get that Planet Normal mug. And thank you for a brilliant email as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Isabel Bajard, Elliot Lampitt, Cass Ho, Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.